Hafide, and welcome to the first 2022 episode of My Story. I'm your host, Destiny Cruz. Today's episode, we'll learn of an inspiring woman's story of loss, revelation, and resilience. This woman is Julianne Corn-Lee, a survivor, author, and advocate who now shares her journey with leukemia to offer support and connection for those with a shared experience and their loved ones. Could you just tell me a little bit about yourself and your life growing up in Guam?
That's an easy one. I was born and raised in Guam, and during my childhood, I lived in my family compound in Maite. Our home was known as the Pagoda, which was nestled on a cliff overlooking Agana Bay. Our extended family included my parents, 6 siblings, aunts, uncles, and numerous first cousins. And our extended family was headed by my maternal grandfather, Charles Corn. My grandfather was a prominent businessman on the island at the time. And at any rate, in 1980, I graduated from high school, from the academy, at which time I moved to San Francisco to attend college, where I joined my older sisters here in the Bay Area. And I've been living in the Bay Area ever since.
I wanted to ask you, since this is my story and it is centered around, people's journey with their illnesses. I know it's not something that defines you, but I just wanted to ask you, what were the signs or symptoms that you were experiencing that were a cause for concern? And if you could tell me a little bit about, after that, if you could tell me a little bit about your diagnosis.
Okay. Well, let me just start off. In 1988, I was diagnosed with acute myelogenous leukemia, AML cancer. It's a type of leukemia. And let's see. My symptoms, it was a bit unusual because my presenting symptom was 104-degree temperature. And this was in the spring, so it wasn't like flu season or anything like that. I was only 26 at the time. I went to see my internist, and she diagnosed me with, or I should say she misdiagnosed me with a bad virus. She prescribed antibiotics and sent me home and say, get plenty of bed rest and chicken soup. Again, I was so young and I had no experience with illness, either in my generation or my parents' generation. So I listened to what she said. She was the expert after all. And I went home, stayed in bed. Well, the problem was the 104 temperature continued for the next week. 1 full week of 104-degree temperature. It was really bad. It was probably the worst I'd ever felt throughout my illness. And again, the physician assured me it was just a bad virus. She said, continue taking the antibiotics, you'll be fine. So again, I listened to what she said, and I didn't listen to my own body. I felt horrible, as I mentioned. And so by the second week, I developed an infection in my throat. I couldn't speak, I couldn't eat, I couldn't drink. What got me to the ER was I suffered a massive stroke that left me with complete paralysis on the left side of my body, from my head all the way down to my foot. And I remember the ER team looking at me, the emergency room. They said, you had a fever for how long? And I'm like, 2 weeks. It was unbelievable because today, without a medical background, I know anyone presenting with 104-degree temperature for even a couple of days, blood work should be ordered. If my physician had ordered blood work, they would have found an elevated white blood count because the cancer cells were growing at an alarming rate. And they were overcrowding my immune system so that my healthy white blood cells weren't functioning. And that explains the reason for the infections that wouldn't go away. Additionally, the overcrowding also decreased my platelet levels. It dropped dramatically, which was the cause of the massive stroke. I had a hemorrhage in my brain, and again, it resulted in left side paralysis. Really, as an inpatient for the first few months, I was in complete shock. I just couldn't figure out why I couldn't walk, and they were talking of this new standard treatment. They said, we're going to give you basically a bone marrow transplant. They use high dose chemo and radiation treatment to obliterate your immune system. So you are at zero white blood count. You can catch any infection. And the statistics for survival rates at that time was very low. But I think what helped me was that my mind wasn't focused on the grim statistic. I was focused on, why can't I walk? I just couldn't believe that was happening. Right. So in a way, there were some benefits, if you will, to it. I mean, it's odd to say that, but in retrospect, I would have to say that it did help me get through that acute phase. But right. In the years ahead, I really believe in, there's this control theory. There's nothing we can do to control our emotions, they say. So I remember during my years of rehab and the years that followed, many years after that, I told myself, you know what, it's okay to feel depressed. If you're feeling sad, you can feel sad, but do it while you're out walking. And every time I felt sad, which was a lot of days, I hit the trail behind our area, I would walk. And I found that, wow, when I walk, I'm out in the sunshine and the wind is hitting me, and I would forget of my grim state and how depressed I was, or whatever the case was. So that was one of the things that came to me by instinct. I said, I have to do something. I just can't sit here and feel sad. I got to go out and do something. And I think that helped immensely.
When someone you love is sick, it really does have an impact on you. Yeah. So I wanted to ask you, how did your diagnosis impact the people in your life that were close to you? Of course, this is something life-changing for you, but this is also life-changing for the people that love you. So what was that like for them?
It was devastating. I still remember my mother and what she went through, even though I was an adult. It was devastating for her. It was devastating. I am from a large family. We're 7 kids altogether. It was devastating for everyone because, again, we had never experienced, my grandfather's death in the 1970s was the only loss we had really experienced up till my diagnosis. So it was difficult, but their love and support was really what got me through. I have 4 wonderful sisters, 2 brothers. And, they would take shifts and they would come stay with me because transplant patients were in isolation. So they would stay in the room with me to pass the day and the time. So I had a lot of support. And I guess we supported one another through that time.
That's beautiful. And I'm sure that, having that familial support is something that's, so important to people during that time, not just when we're healthy and when we're happy. I think that's the true testament, to know that there are always people who will love you and support you, even in your worst times, which is
exactly,
something that unfortunately not everybody has. And that's just right. The reality of life. But I'm so happy that you had that during that time. What does your life look like now? How is your health now? How is, the love that surrounds you now?
In general, I am in very good health for 33. By the way, this year I am 33 years post bone marrow transplant. I'm a long-term cancer survivor, and I've had a good run for 33 years. I'm generally in good health. I have been dealing with some chronic issues that developed from the high-dose treatment I received 33 years ago, but they're chronic illnesses, and it's manageable. Today, I do meaningful work. I work for the American Cancer Society, patient advocacy. Because of my experience, I had a way of navigating the system. If I needed a resource, I'd go out and I'd find it. So my passion, although I did return and I received earned master's degree in psychology, ultimately my passion was in patient advocacy. So I began a career in the nonprofit sector.
What advice would you give to people who are experiencing something similar to you? And also, what advice would you give to their family members who are also going on this journey with them?
It's probably the same advice. The advice is to stay in the moment. I think we have a tendency to look too far ahead, and we get overwhelmed, especially dealing with a cancer diagnosis. So all I know right now is that I'm fine. And that's what I focus on. I'm not going to think about, well, how is this going to impact my life a year from now? You know, I think that's why children do so much, pediatric patients do well, because they don't think future like adults do. So to stay in the moment would be my advice.
Thank you for that. I just want to share really briefly. I have a really strong connection to cancer because my papa was just diagnosed last year. So, when we're on this topic, I can really relate to what you mean, that it affects, not only the person, but to also witness them going through this. It's something it is devastating. But thank you for sharing that piece of advice, because I will take that with me moving forward. When we return, Julianne Cornley discusses her memoir, Thunderclap: A Defining Silence, the inspiration behind her story, and how she found healing through the writing process. All this when My Story returns. I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about your work with patient advocacy, because I know in your experience, your body was telling you that something was wrong, and you went to get checked, and you were told you were misdiagnosed, unfortunately. So what would you say to people who might be experiencing something similar to you, where they feel that something is wrong, but they don't, people are telling them, oh, this is not what you're feeling. What is your advice to them?
Oh, trust your body. It speaks volumes. And for me, I was unaware of that. And so in my work, our focus is on prevention and early detection and educating the public about the importance of screening and early detection. So that goes hand in hand, It's just to be aware of our bodies and to follow up. So yeah, that has been my passion. My first passion was really my book. I knew from the very start that I would write a book, and I don't ask me where this came from. It's not like I was an aspiring writer or author in any way. I wasn't. The only things I had written up to that time were college term papers, which I did not enjoy. I had no idea. I had no plans to write anything. But for some reason, when it happened, I knew, part of me knew that I was going to write something, and I had to write it on my own. I didn't want to hire or get a ghostwriter to do it. I said, no, I'm going to do this in my own words.
But without giving too much away, could you just explain why Thunderclap: A Defining Silence was, an all-encompassing title for your story?
Thunderclap, I didn't have a tagline when I started the project. I knew the title was going to be Thunderclap, or The Thunderclap. And the reason for that is that a few weeks before my stroke, I was home with my siblings. And during those days, we really got into the I Ching, which is a 2,000-year-old system of fortune telling from China. At any rate, the process is that you toss coins, you ask a question, and the coins, depending on how they land, will refer to a particular reading in the I Ching. So I went ahead, I said, I'll ask a question. I think my question was something silly. It had nothing to do with anything. But the reading I got was reading number 51, entitled The Thunderclap. And the first line that read, this is a time of sudden and catastrophic loss.
Excuse me.
It was so profound, this reading. And then we were all like, what? Doesn't make any sense, right? And I remember being in the hospital room and my brother coming to me and said, you have to read the reading again. I said, what are you talking about? He said, the I Ching reading. Oh my God, Destiny, when I read it, the hair on my arm stood up. It spoke of everything that happened. This is a time of catastrophic loss. You will become wiser and stronger than you were, which didn't make sense to me at the time of the reading. So that was my title. I knew that the title of my book was going to be called Thunderclap. I dedicated the book to another patient his name is Stephen. Stephen, as I mentioned, I was so desperate to meet someone else. At any rate, so I was at the hospital after my transplant. I remember one of the nurses came to me and said, we want to introduce you to another patient who also had a stroke. I said, what? She said, it's a young guy. He was probably in his teens, 18, 19 years old.
Wow.
And I said, what do you mean he had a stroke? I mean, there was a part of me that was overjoyed, like, oh my God, finally I get to meet a kindred spirit. At any rate, Stephen and I never met. We saw each other at the hospital in the year that followed, in the months that followed, after I was released. And unfortunately, Stephen did not make it. He did not survive. But he had such a profound impact on me because he was like a lifeline for me. Like, okay, this can happen to anyone. I'm not targeted here. So we kind of knew each other, but we never met. And so I dedicated my book to Stephen.
With the lessons that you learned from experiencing loss, how have those lessons helped you to become more resilient?
It was interesting. I think I mentioned that I earned a master's degree in psychology a few years after my diagnosis. And I really focused on, for some odd reason, grief counseling. The grief process. So as I collected my hours towards my license back then, I worked as a grief counselor and working with clients to process their loss of a loved one. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote a book on death and dying, and she outlined the stages of grief: anger, denial, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And as I worked with these clients, I was the first time I realized I had also gone through a loss. And I am also grieving for the person I once was. So that was it was cathartic for me when I realized that I have to process the grief. And what makes me resilient, you said, is that I understand loss. It's like you had mentioned earlier, loss is universal. We all suffer losses. And so one of the things I knew is that this is a part of life and it's temporary. Everything is temporary. So this too shall pass, right? That's saying?
Yeah.
So that's how I've become resilient, because I understand that it's temporary and I process on a writing the book, talk about processing on a deep level. You cannot BS your way through anything when you're writing. It's better than therapy. It's better than talk therapy, because it was a very honest look at what I went through and the process I underwent, I experienced to get to the point where I am now.
How is your life now? What are you doing now? What are you focusing on in the moment? What are things that bring you joy now?
Well, I'm very fortunate, as I mentioned, my siblings, we're all in the San Francisco Bay Area. So we're still connected, and we're a tight-knit group, I have to say. I've been in a long-term relationship. My partner has been instrumental and vital in my project, in this book, and in my story. He has been wonderful support for me. So my life is pretty good, I'd have to say.
Yeah.
And of course, I continue to do the meaningful work I love. I'm still passionate about the work I do.
Yes. Thank you so much for sharing. And again, the last thing that I want to ask you is for, just a piece of advice that you can leave us with before we conclude the interview, not just for people who, are experiencing something similar to you, but just in general. What is a piece of advice that you would want to give to people who are listening to your story?
Well, I think, I was talking to a survivor recently, and I said, for me, I found a way of healing, which was writing. And that, again, I don't know where that came from, but it could be painting, it could be anything, for an individual, but find a way to find that voice and express it. Because the writing process for me has been cathartic. And to find that, I feel like I've come full circle. Today I work with hospitals, with cancer accredited hospitals. I was working with my medical team, my facility where I received my treatment, and talk about coming full circle for me. But find something meaningful. And I believe that I gave meaning. I found subconsciously, I gave meaning to my experience, which has really helped me in my healing journey. So I don't know if that makes sense.
Oh,
But
that makes so much, that
yeah.
makes all the sense in the world. Thank you so much, Julianne. I'm very honored once again to be able to listen to your story and to be able to just learn about your life experiences. Definitely, it's something that I'm going to take with me, not just after today, but moving forward. And I'm really grateful. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I am thrilled to be your first interviewee this year, right?
Yes, in general, you are my very first interview for my
Okay.
story. So thank you so much. You did amazing. It's going to be hard to follow up after this, I swear. But I'm really looking forward to hopefully meeting you when you come back to Guam in February. And
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, for sure. It was an absolute honor and privilege to be able to learn of Julianne's story. A beautiful lesson shared by Julianne is to focus and live in the moment as it is where we are now. Thank you for joining us today on My Story. I'll see you next time.